So, to set the scene before we begin and before I introduce the panel, it's true, I'm a cultural place-shaping strategist. I work with Ing. Some of you I've seen in the audience at lunch, and it's lovely to bump into you. My other life, I live a double life. I cover circular fashion, circular design, and product investment for the Financial Times. So to be here, to be able to talk about this topic with effectively a cross-section of the industry is, not to sound like a nerd, but it is a dream come true, because 4 years ago, I'm sure you all remember the climate strikes that were on Lambeth Bridge and outside Westminster. There was this moment of existential crisis as to what London would be post-Brexit. And someone earlier today at the beginning of our sessions mentioned this lack of certainty. And I just wanted to say that before we begin the discussion, this is through the lens that London is a resilient city. London is also a centre for innovation. So it's through a positive narrative that we're hoping to tackle the topic of all things sustainable and circular. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce the panel. And if we could start with you, Jed.
I'm Jed Simmons. I'm Managing Director of Mace for the private sector business. Mace is a large construction and consultancy business.
Hi, I'm Emma Harvey-Smith. I am a Programme Director at the Green Finance Institute, and I lead our work on decarbonising the built environment. The Green Finance Institute works with the finance sector and with the wider ecosystem to help identify the financial solutions that are needed to decarbonise our economy, and then works with the finance sector to make that happen.
Hi, I'm Mark Tillett from Hain Tillett Steel. We're civil and structural engineers based in London and Manchester.
I'm Harriet Newport. I work at the Infrastructure Projects Authority. We report into Cabinet Office. We support the top 200 projects that the government sponsors. So yes, that is the HS2 New Hospitals Programme. We work on project delivery, not on policy, so I won't be commenting on policy or individual projects.
Disclaimer.
Just to warn you, thank you.
I'm James Atherton, Development Director at the Crown Estate, with particular responsibility for the reinvigoration of Regent Street and Piccadilly.
Wonderful, thank you. So to warm you all up, I have a question for the group. You've got a minute each to answer. So my first question is, culturally and collectively, as with the ongoing debate around measuring, it's a big topic right now, and hence the theme around value, how can we better make the economic and social value case when tackling the topic of the circular economy in the sustainable construction and retrofit debate? Jed, because you're sitting next to me, you first.
I think for me it sits in three parts really, I suppose. I think we have a moral duty, to be honest, those people in positions of authority to actually sort of make an impact. I think then there's actually a business need. Those for businesses that are forward-looking and progressive are usually the ones that are more successful, and I think that business need is sort of exemplified by the point you're making there, that those at the forefront of that will be the more successful organisations. And I think with social value there's also local requirements. You know, we can't forget, certainly from my perspective in the construction industry, we work in local environments, and it's important that we don't forget those local needs, and how we engage with those communities is very important as well. Thank
you very much. Emma.
So I've been told I'm the first person here to be talking about residential, so brace yourselves. So I'm going to tackle this actually from less of a sustainable construction perspective and more of a residential retrofitting perspective, because we know that we do need to decarbonise almost all of our homes. Why is that important? Well, decarbonising our UK building stock will, A, reduce household bills, particularly in a time of the energy and cost of living crisis. 2, it helps to increase the UK's energy security. And 3, it creates thousands of skilled jobs across the country. And that's not even to mention the health benefits that come from decarbonising our building stock, expected to save at least £1 billion a year for the NHS, according to the BRE. So there's economic benefits, there's those social benefits, but the bit that we focus on at the GFI is how do you finance that? And that is where we do need public, private and blended finance.
Brilliant, thank you. Mark.
Okay, I've got 3 points, hopefully quick. We're construction industry professionals. We have a massive impact on the low carbon, the climate emergency. Compared to any of your friends, you know, who might do lifestyle choices like becoming vegan, having fewer children, electric cars, all this stuff. You know, we've analysed this. We have hundreds or 1,000 times the impact of those lifestyle choices. So we have a moral responsibility to do the right thing. And I think one problem I've got with the industry at the moment is that it's kind of still a bit box ticking. I think the London commercial office market actually leads the UK, certainly and possibly Europe, but it's still a lot of box ticking. We've got to do it from the heart and the head and do it right from the outset. Next point is, maybe it's because I'm a Londoner, but the benefits of sustainability go and retention go well beyond carbon. Less noise, less pollution, less concrete trucks and tipper trucks that kill cyclists. You know, it's buildings back to market far quicker. You know, it has a massive impact on the local community in London. And I think that's almost 50% of the argument for retention. And very finally, just to be led by the heart, the head, listen to the young staff. They're the guys who kicked us up the arse 5 years ago in our office. We were measuring carbon for years, but they really got us to make influence and not just measure it, and spread the word from ground workers to agents.
Thank you. So in the IPA, we have something called Transforming Infrastructure Performance. And what it's really advocating is moving away from looking at outputs, but to outcomes, which you've probably heard before, but looking through the lens of sustainable development goals to do that. And how they sort of talk about it is looking at different systems, so the built environment system, the natural environment system, and getting data and transparency on the different things we need to think about in these systems so that we can make better decisions. So what that looks like for me and for our team in sustainability is we're looking at indicators, how do we measure, or how do we give transparency as much as possible to all the different things we need to think about when we're looking at outcomes and value. And just to give one example, we've been working very hard across government on looking at whole life carbon, so not just your operational carbon, but your embodied carbon as well. Because if you don't really know your whole life impact of your project, how can you really make the right decisions about those trade-offs you need to do? So that's what we're sort of trying to work on.
Thank you. James?
So from a social value perspective, I think that from a Crown Estate perspective, it's looking beyond it being a comparative to finance and economics, and that it's an underlying assumption within what we're doing. So whether that be setting KPIs for our contracting partners or setting targets for the design teams, it's about thinking that this is a guideline we have to live and have to develop by. So with that set, on an asset-by-asset basis, you can ask yourself less questions as to whether you're delivering social value because it's inherent in the work that you're doing. I think, though, the real opportunity within us delivering better social value, and whether that goes to measuring it or not, I think is, and perhaps by the by, is that to deliver the true value, it's where we're going and thinking on a portfolio basis. So for us, thinking on a district-wide basis, not one unit versus another unit versus another office. And at that point, we can start to open up different opportunities for letting, for uses, and then beyond that, looking at what is the big challenges for us all is the skills agenda, thinking collaboratively with other landlords. We had a project earlier in the year with Grosvenor and Peabody and National Trust, looking at that skill gap and the shortage, which indicated there is a significant skills gap, and actually that as a social good, to start delivering against those skills gaps is really where development can start to have a positive impact.
Brilliant, thank you. So now we're going to drill down to each of your respective practices, and Jed, back to you. My question is, what is the role of product innovation in driving down, or in the driving down, of embodied carbon in the construction industry?
So it obviously has a big role to play, product innovation, but it does start really with design. And I think when we look at any particular project, and I think this is happening more and more, particularly the retrofit market, which has been discussed a lot over the last few days, it starts, I suppose, with retaining what's already there. And what are the opportunities and options around that? And they might not be the only option, but what can actually be done with the physical asset that actually exists? That then leads on, I suppose, to what you can do with the component parts within that asset. And what we do as part of our role is when we go into a project, we will actually list out all the requisite parts within the building, almost like an asset register. And there might be somewhere between 25 and 40 different individual items in there. And then we'll go back on a case-by-case basis saying which of those parts can we either leave within the building or reutilize and refurbish. So we've got some fantastic examples, often very simple ones, where we've taken ceilings out of buildings or raised access flooring out and refinished them, repurposed them, then put them back into the building, right the way through to much larger ones. A project not too far from here, the old BT headquarters, 81 Newgate, where we took all the stone off the building, re-cleaned it, recut it and finished it, put it onto new panels, then brought it back to the site. So that probably 85 to 90% of the stone on that building actually went back onto the building itself. So that I would very much say is a form of innovation.
Yep.
Then, of course, you're moving into the new products themselves. And this is moving at such a pace for us in the industry in terms of how new products are evolving and developing. And I think everyone's trying to do their part in it. You know, we are very much driving the supply chain to help us with this. And again, there's been great examples recently of people like Saint-Gobain who brought out a new glass that's 40% reduction in body carbon. You've got people like Circle 75, which is using repurposed aluminium to go back into the facades, which again has a massive dent in terms of the carbon footprint. And then, of course, there's a lot of conversations around cement-free products and how you do that. I mean, some alarming statistics around that still for me is that 50% of the raw materials around the globe are actually still used in the built environment. So back to Mark's point, there's massive, massive inroads we can make. Yeah. And, you know, even things like cement, I was talking about that, there's still 15 million tonnes of concrete used in this country every day, which is 13.5 million tonnes of carbon. So what we're trying to do is sort of develop components. And in Mace, we've got a program called the low carbon cassette, which is effectively, if you like, a concrete plank that has a low carbon content with an innovative use of steel in it. But that's 55% reduction in body carbon by using components like that alone. So I think it's no one silver bullet in this, I think, and the whole industry needs to pull together with the designers, starting with the clients, which are doing some great work in this space in terms of looking at the existing assets. We have to support that, I think, and get on board with that. And therefore, the early engagement of contracts and the specialists is more important than it ever has been to get that bit right. And then right the way through to the product that actually comes through the gate as well.
Thank you. That was very thorough. Thank you, Jim. My next question, Emma, and I know I gave you the prerequisite that today, a lot of the conversations I've heard have been very centred in the commercial side of real estate and the built environment. You know, with Green Finance Institute, I know that your strength is coming from the more residential, consumer-facing conversations. So I'd love if you could, you know, when it comes to defining, first and foremost, green finance, help to kind of just give a little bit more light on, you know, the data we've seen from the Green Building Council that suggests that by 2050, 80% of all the housing stock that exists will already have been built. Could you talk us through some of the work Green Finance is doing to optimize that existing stock and better educate landlords and occupiers on how to navigate, you know, these challenges that we're facing, such as, for example, historic buildings and, you know, that battle between innovation and conservation that's really got London under a chokehold right now?
Fantastic. Very happy to tackle that. And I think to start off, I think that's a brilliant statistic that you shared from the UK Green Building Council. Most of the buildings in the UK are still going to be here by 2050. So, as I mentioned earlier, we need to retrofit them. And actually, some of the stats that the Climate Change Committee has shared is that just under a quarter of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions are due to our built environment, and 3/4 of those are due to our homes. So there is a huge emissions challenge happening there. And the thing is, with homes as well as with offices, they impact your day-to-day life, and many consumers are going to have to make a decision around improving their home. Now, the Climate Change Committee has estimated that upwards of £250 billion of investment is going to be needed to decarbonise our homes. So there is a huge investment gap, and therefore we do need innovative new financial solutions to be designed and brought to market that will help people at any point in their lifetime to be able to actually improve their home. And that is where the Green Finance Institute comes in. Through our work, through our Built Environment Programme and our Coalition for the Energy Efficiency of Buildings, we have brought together over 400 financial and retrofit experts to work with us to work out what those barriers are to decarbonising and how finance can help to address those challenges. So just to give you a few examples, so I'll stop talking in generality. So I'm sure many people here have heard of a mortgage. Have you heard of a green mortgage? Well, a green mortgage helps you to fund improvements to the energy efficiency of your home, and it can offer you a lower interest rate, it can offer you a cashback, it can offer you a higher borrowing capacity, it could offer you a free energy efficiency assessment and point you in the direction of trusted construction and installation individuals. Now, this market, when the GFI first launched back in 2019, was very limited. There was only 3 green mortgages in the market. And we recognised that many lenders were nervous about entering this market because of the risk of greenwashing. So we looked to other success stories in the finance landscape, and we recognised that if we were to develop some green home finance principles, very similar to the green bond principles, that could give the finance community the confidence they needed to innovate. And so we launched them back in 2020. And we have double-digit numbers of lenders aligned to the principles. And today we have over 60 green mortgage products available. So please do go to the GFI's website if you want to see what that full list of products are. That's just one example, though, and we're continually trying to push the market. There's other solutions, though, where we can look internationally. So in the States, they have a product called Property Assessed Clean Energy Finance, or PACE. It is now a $13 billion market. Wow. It is financing huge commercial developments. I'd love to talk about an example later on the panel of a property that was converted from office to residential. I'll talk about that later. The unique property of PACE is that the financing or the obligation to repay that energy efficiency finance is linked to the property rather than the property owner. So you only pay for those energy efficiency measures whilst you're living in the building. When you sell it, the next person who buys it picks up that obligation, benefits from those measures, but pays them. We've seen this be very successful both in commercial and residential properties in the States, and we're exploring how that could be brought over to the UK as well. So there's huge innovation opportunities. That's where the GFI is playing. But finance is not the sole answer. We do need policy, demand drivers, supply chain growth, the innovation that you were talking about, Jed, as well, to make this entire ecosystem work.
Thank you. And you kind of anticipated the curveball I was going to throw at you, in the sense that while we're talking about residential, in the wider conversations around how we regenerate our high street and rethink some of the existing stock, one of the realities that comes with innovation is as businesses want to move to these new buildings that are more energy efficient, it creates the issue of stranded assets. And we've got a few in the news the last couple of months. First, we've got HSBC exiting Canary Wharf. More recently, in the FT, you've seen Meta exiting Regent's Place. So there is a conversation that's being had amongst local authorities, all across London, whether some of these former commercial spaces would be possible to help solve the housing crisis, but surely that brings us back to the same challenge of retrofitting for the housing sector. So I have that question to throw both at yourself and James, if you want to jump in as a landlord for the high street as well. But if you could just share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. And I think I will just speak to an example in the States where they are having the exact same dynamic, people working from home, stranded assets, huge, often very beautiful office buildings that are available, but no one's filling them. So how do you convert them to potentially residential? And I want to talk about one building. It's called the Aronson Building in San Francisco, which is I think it's a 19th century building. And it's just been converted from offices into private residences, as well as a Mexican museum as well. And what they did, as well as converting that building into residential, and I'm going to read quote by quote, they also made significant energy efficiency upgrades and resiliency measures such as rooftop stormwater recycling systems and increased insulation. Now that was funded by that PACE solution that I mentioned. It was the biggest deal that they've done to date. It was $256 million, funded by PACE, but has now created a really interesting, thriving community in San Francisco. That's a case study, but I know James is going to be able to talk to that far more expertly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've obviously got very different stock to Canary Wharf stock.
Oh,
so,
yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean it that way. No, grade 2 listed, obviously. Yes.
But sort of joking apart, it all brings its own challenges. So I am lucky enough to work on an estate which is set as a heavily retail-based with significant office and other use opportunities above. And we're not in a position where that has come to end of use, but we have got significant heritage buildings up there which will be compared with other options when it comes to tenant occupiers. So, but I think this is where we've all got to work on our own education, our own skill set, in that a retrofit building is not necessarily a less sustainable building. Yeah. It depends, how we go about the refurbishment of it and how we talk about embodied carbon within the delivery of that. And then the innovations and the technologies that are coming forward, which enable us to improve thermal performance and enable us through improved windows, etc. We've got a vast swathes of Crital windows, beautiful, but lightly, very impractical. And so we are looking at how do we make the most of our estate, honour the heritage, but at the same time make sure that these are competitive in today's market versus any other office. So we've got the privilege of location and the opportunity of heritage, perhaps.
Thank you very much. And so, Mark, before I get into my question for you, for those who've not had a chance to look at the installations outside, there was a quote I spotted on my way in that I just wanted to throw back at you because I think it very much sums up this conversation. You said, to make great buildings, we must understand the value of what exists and what it can become, adding the least material along the way. Now, that's, to me, quite profound. And so my question to you is, how important is retention over reuse and recycling in the circularity discussion?
Yeah, okay. To the quote first.
Yes.
I mean, it's so important to understand what you've got and what exists before you do any sketch, and then everyone's driving towards that as an answer. Just completely understand the asset, and then let the design evolve. And it's not how our industry works. You know, we traditionally, the architect might do a vision, and then we have to deliver that vision. Now, for true retention, for true low carbon economy, you have to take everything that exists. You need to sweat it, find out how you can strengthen it, how much it can take, where it's easy to adapt, and where you can push and pull it. So, and that's what that's about, really. Keep as much as you can, and what you put back, make as low carbon as possible. The question about retention in the circular discussion, I never really fully understood the word circularity in terms of low carbon agenda. I used to think it meant you can take a building down, you can put it on the back of a truck, and you can re-erect it in a new location. But that is part of circularity, but the top of the circularity tree is retention. Retention, reuse, recycling. But retention has far greater impact than anything else. You know, 40% of the built environment, we're responsible for carbon emissions, 40% of them, and 50% in a practically completed building is structure. So the more we can keep, massive impact. I think, you know, the way you talk about retention of a building, you're talking about Canary Wharf. We look at different assets. So interwar buildings, which is most of James's estate, built from the 20s to the Second World War. Post-war, which are generally steel frame buildings. Post-war buildings, generally reinforced concrete. After the war, most commercial buildings were rebuilt as reinforced concrete, and residential buildings. And then since the 90s, long span steel frame buildings like Canary Wharf. So the interwar buildings, brilliant to adapt, steel frames, super adaptable. They can kind of become nearly anything you want it to be. Post-war reinforced concrete buildings can definitely be anything they can be. Loads of benefits, quite heavy adaptation, but they can serve as life science, residential, hotel, every kind of use. The problem, children, really, are the 90s and onwards buildings, these long span structures. You look at Canary Wharf, everyone leaving Canary Wharf. What do these buildings become? Now, there are ways we can adapt those to even become life science, but it's not straightforward, it's not easy. So I think the circularity debate is both about our existing stock. We have to retain as much as possible. And yeah, there's lots of buildings which just can't be retained. And they'll forever be a blight and be mothballed if you do try and make them work. Load-bearing masonry buildings, very challenging. But in terms of new buildings, we need to be thinking about how do you make this building adaptable, okay? Uses and what the users expect, and tenancy periods are changing faster than ever. Tenancy periods reducing more and more. People don't take 15, 20-year leases anymore. So the building's going to have to change and adapt, and it's going to have to change to uses that we never really had in London, like life science. So the true long life, loose fit approach is to look at a 200-year view, not a 60-year view on a building. And buildings we're refurbishing now, we take the view this is the next chapter in this building's life. So don't take out all the opportunity, okay? And you're custodians of this until the next generation come along and take it along. I mean, in terms of, you mentioned whole life carbon. I've been at a couple of pre-apps with Westminster recently, and actually the most important thing to the sustainability officer at Westminster is now percentage retention. It's not whole life carbon, because I think they've seen too many 30-year-old buildings taken down. You know, the life of a double glazed unit, and it's taken down. What they want to see is not a projection into the future, which is based on a whole load of assumptions. They want to see what you can do now. How much can you retain? So it's about kind of, you know, taking a forward foot, arming yourself with all the information at the beginning, knowing your building, looking out the windscreen, not the rear view mirror, which has traditionally been the approach to sustainability, and setting off on the right foot.
Thank you. And not to trivialise what you just said, but I still report on fashion, and I'm going to borrow that phrase. Long life, loose fit, I think is so good, isn't it?
It's the oldest one, and it's still the best one.
It's definitely, it's brilliant. Thank you for that. And so my next question, Harriam, is for you. And when it comes to the conversation about scaling circular economy design principles into the realm of construction, is it fair to say there is still work to be done across upskilling, reskilling, and education in the new language of realising value in second-hand, used and recycled materials?
Thank you. I'm going to take that into 3 parts. So
Yep.
first on the upskilling, reskilling piece, I think actually there's a dual dilemma here actually. So there's the reskilling and having the people and skilling them up. So getting enough people accredited of past 2080, for example, definitely a challenge we're facing right now. But there's also the behavioural change.
Yes.
I think that's a really important part of this whole journey. I went on just an anecdote. I went to the Forge. It's a new Landsat building in Bankside in London. It's a net zero commercial building, and it was built using sort of platform approach. So going to get this, design, manufacture, and assembly, always get that wrong, approach. And it was really fascinating to listen to the innovation director talk about it. I went to a site visit, and how the challenge of actually, they go for the design, everything's been done in a different way, but when you actually get to building it and getting the builders on site to start doing things differently, there was a real challenge because people were used to doing it in a certain way. And obviously once you got over that and overcame that, people realized, it's much faster, it was safer. But that behavioural change is a real challenge that I think we all need to think about actually within our own areas. And I think with with this whole environmental challenges ahead, we need to all of us get used to being uncomfortable, actually. So it's discomfort for the builders, but it's discomfort for us in taking risks, for challenging, etc. So I think that's a real behaviour shift. We can't keep doing the things we've done before because we know it works, because that's not the way we're going to go forward. On the circular economy piece, I think Mark's actually said a lot of things that I was going to say. So definitely, I think there's a lot of discussion. We still talk a lot about recycling and waste, but we do need to talk about reusing. There's a great platform called Excess Materials Exchange. They're doing some great stuff in getting people's waste materials and then finding new homes for it so they can use it. And they've just launched their UK site, actually. So that's great. But then the retention question is really obviously critical. Building something that I think the core building can last for a lot longer, and then you've got to think about the retrofit. Interesting that you said that tendencies are decreasing, so we need to think about that. But I'm not an economist or a commercial developer, but I always wonder about those lifespans. If you're evaluating a building, you're doing a return on investment for a 30-year or 60-year lifetime. That doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't. I don't know how that can make sense. So whilst tendencies are changing, as you say, the long lifetime, if you've got a longer period, you can then obviously expend your costs and net return over a longer period. But maybe on the financing side, how do we encourage that? Again, a risk and people taking longer term views on getting returns. And finally, on the scaling up part of the question, I've learnt Yasmin does long questions. Sorry.
I only get one chance to grill them.
So the scaling up piece, I think, obviously it lies in the obvious thing about collaboration. This is really about working across the value chain. How do all the different players come together? One interesting example, there's a paper that's come out called Our Shared Understanding, a Circular Economy for the Built Environment. It's, again, not a long title, I've just got it. Great work getting all people across the industry and different sectors to work together to get a common understanding of what it means. But we need to go further, and I think we really need to somebody uses the word reimagine the value chain so we can start thinking things differently, creating new business models, creating new business opportunities, and actually using the constraints to create more value. So.
Thank you very much. And you answered that long question beautifully. There you go. James, my next question for you, I'm going to kind of set the stage a little because it's quite selfish that I'm asking this of you. In my previous life, before I joined Ing, was a senior strategist at Future City, and the first cultural strategy I ever wrote was the Heart of London Business Alliance, of which Crown Estate is a very significant stakeholder. And coming from my FT luxury fashion background, it was really interesting to be challenged in the middle of lockdown, thinking about how we rethink retail. And one of the things that I learned in the process of writing that strategy, and as you made your point, Mark, about tenancy, the kind of turnover, particularly in luxury, actually, I'm thinking about some of your tenants now, the real kind of culprit is the Scope 3 Cat A fit out. And if you're thinking about the world of fashion consumption, over-consumption, there is a very high turnover every time they change their fit-out and their aesthetic. So my question to you, on behalf of Crown Estate, is when it comes to this problem, in trying to meet these ambitious net zero targets, can you share any initiatives that you're currently working on that supports not only the retrofit and sustainable construction ideal, but is going to deliver a longer-term, more sustainable approach to reducing impact at that stage?
Yeah, sure. We actually just had a conversation on at the back where we talked about expanding questions, and you've asked a very long question. I'm probably like to expand on it, so apologies if I do. But I think there's probably two key elements to this from my mind. One is a partnership through delivery, and it goes probably beyond retail into other uses as well, into offices, into delivery of hotels where it's more bespoke. And it's really the timing of that partnership of your delivery. So from an office perspective, for example, very traditionally, landlords go in, complete the Cat A, tenant comes in, rips out half the Cat A, does the Cat B, and carbon's falling into the zinc all the time. Next tenant comes in, you rip out what they've done, they have to put it back to the condition they found it in. All of these things are set up for clarity between parties. And I think that in many facets of real estate, frankly, we're moving to a point where partnerships have to be stronger than a landlord and tenant relationship or a landlord and customer relationship, which is what we tend to call them. It's about having a combined and considered approach to it. Now, sometimes that's more challenging than others. So to take a retail example, the Quadrant Arcade, which sits next to Air Street, just off Regent Street, development we did just prior to the COVID pandemic. Probably not perfect timing to be delivering a new retail small scheme, but also arcades are traditionally a challenging asset class for retail anyway. They're very traditional uses, and therefore, when they're disrupted, they're hard to re-establish. So we've taken an approach there, which is a longer-term commitment to each unit. So we've put the flooring in, we've put the staircases in, we've put it in a condition where a tenant can come in and plug and play. So that when they leave, their broom-swept condition isn't back to a stripped-out, fully empty unit. It's a unit that somebody else can go in and plug and play. So should it be that tenant that wants to upgrade what they're doing and they want to move to another unit of ours, then great, and then we free up the unit. Or if it's entirely new to coming in. So it just puts us in a position where we can start to do that. Now, that's not appropriate for every unit, and tenants will have their different ideas about what they want to do and deliver, and it will go with fashion cycles. And I am definitely not the wisdom on the carbon impact of the fashion industry. But for what we can do, I think it's heavily around partnership. I think it's worth saying also that when we're thinking about the Scope 3 emissions, it's not just the fit-out element, but how that unit is used. So for us in the design phase, it's setting up, how can we reduce the operational carbon that will be incurred in this building, no matter how it's used. So if we have a financial tenant come into one of the offices and they have to run with 6 screens on each desk, that's going to be a bit more intensive. But if the building's set up so that that intensity of use is delivered at the lowest possible carbon, then we as a landlord and as a partner in that building have put in a positive impact into the way that it's run. And that then gives us the ability to have an influence over that Scope 3. Sadly, it's all about collaboration still.
No, I don't think that's a sad thing. I think that's a positive thing, because I don't think we're going to get anywhere without collaboration. So it's interesting to understand that is really the kind of angle we're going for. So before I throw that back to Jed and Mark, if you want to add any comments to Scope 3, just to remind you, and I'm really sorry to the team, I forgot to tell the audience, if you've got questions, please submit them via the hashtag LREF2023. My brain is starting to check out now, so let's kind of run to the end. Mark and Jed, did you have anything to add to my query on Scope 3? How do we reduce impact at that stage?
I mean, you covered the points. I mean, we do still see quite a lot of Cat A fit-outs going in a modern office building, and I think we are seeing a lot more clients, I haven't said that, looking at shell core and a show floor. So there is changing trends going on. And some of this, perhaps to the points you're talking about, relates to some of the points I was talking about earlier on there. I think we have to increasingly look at what exists within those buildings as assets in their own right. There is a habit at the moment in our industry, or a habit or trend, what are we going to call it, a historic trend of whenever we strip things out, they just go in the skip and then we buy all new and we put it back in again. And one of the issues we are actually struggling with in the industry is actually volume of material to supply that repurposed market. So raised access flooring being a good example of that. There is actually a huge shortage of second-hand raised access flooring. Similar in the steel world. There's only about 4,000 or 5,000 tonnes, I think, of steel, and I might want to validate that. It's something of that ilk that is actually being certified for reuse back in the built environment. So it's something I've talked about quite a few times, that the demolition contractors should start referring to themselves as reclamation contractors, and it's no longer view things as just coming out and going to skip, but how do we actually take those materials and repurpose them, maybe not for the same building, but for somewhere else to go as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's good points raised by James there. You know, there's so much hidden carbon in our industry, none of it's measured. We measure the stuff on the drawings, but all of the temporary works, lots associated with demolition, we measure the main demolition stuff, but endless fit-outs of buildings, all of that goes under the radar. And we can, you know, all that really matters is the carbon we're expelling into the atmosphere, not the kind of tick box or the spreadsheet or any of the rest of it. And until we start measuring all of that and penalising it, to be honest with you, we're not going to progress properly as a global initiative, really, you know. And I think James works for obviously the Crown Estate, and like the other London estates, they have a vested interest in the complete life of that building. You don't tend to sell your assets, so you care about adaptability. And I know we're working with you guys now, and you're walking the walk. We're building adaptability into structures we're working with these guys on. And that the problem is, I think, that the development model is develop, let, sell. And there's no initiative there for the developer to actually build adaptability into that building. It might cost them a bit more money, and there's no benefit. So you need, I've talked for years about a carbon tax. You need to tax everything you do in terms of carbon terms to a building. You know, if you need to recore it in 5 years because it was a completely bespoke design and you've changed use, there needs to be a penalty for that. And only then can you begin to actually truly build sustainably.
That's interesting, because to your point, James, that's a bit of collaboration with policymakers too, to kind of get around the table and think creatively about how to incentivise or de-incentivise current practices. We've had a few questions coming through, so thank you. This one's very specific. It's from Anonymous. It says, we're a supplier with a deep commitment to sustainability-decarbonisation, but this comes at some cost and VE can be devastating. When will value win over cost? Now, who wants to answer that one?
I don't want to go that. We are seeing clients make some very different decisions to perhaps those they would have made a few years ago. So I have some very real examples where clients have actually come forward, asked for alternative options that may well cost them more money, but reduce the carbon, the embodied carbon of the building. So, you know, I do talk about it as that sort of, often in a tender situation, we look at cost and we look at programme, we look at team, but carbon is without doubt right up there. Yeah. So what we do when we tender our subcontracts, we actually ask the supply chains to come forward with alternatives that are actually reductions in carbon, not necessarily money. And we put them forward to clients, and we have some very real examples where people have spent not just small amounts of money, but hundreds of thousands of pounds making conscious decisions to go with something like XCAR. British Land have done this at Canada Water, and it's cost them a lot of money to do it, but they know it's the right thing to do for that development, and it's certainly made a big indent into the embodied carbon of the building. So we are starting to see those trends change a bit.
Okay, that's positive. Thank you very much. Before I move on to the next question, does anyone have anything they wanted to add to that?
I think only to reiterate that from a developer side, that is exactly the approach that we're taking. We are asking the question of our design teams and pushing design teams, and almost to your point earlier on, that this is about people feeling slightly more uncomfortable. So when we've gone this route because that's the right route, and we've decided, we're asking the question about, well, don't decide for us. Tell us what the carbon impact of that is. Tell us what the other options are from a carbon perspective, and we'll decide whether that's a more expensive but worthwhile investment for us. So from our perspective, already happening.
And just one more addition on that. I think it's very important to have those conversations very early on in the process. You know, we talk about front-end loading, because I think what happens quite often, you know, we hear about social value, and it's always done at the very end. Oh, no, go sign a contract. Oh, let's add that in. And if you've done that, you know, it's too late. You know, you're almost retrofitting already. So it's about really having those conversations early on. I'm spending a lot of time looking at how we measure things, but I'm also fully cognizant that actually measurement is not the answer to everything, and it's about having those strategic discussions very early on to make sure that value in the broader sense is really part of that conversation and not something you think of, you know, afterwards. I think that's really important. So thanks for the question.
And I'd definitely add as well, just from the financing side, we're obviously seeing an increasing use of sustainability-linked loans, where your interest rate is dictated by meeting particular sustainability KPIs. Again, on having those early conversations, I think we sometimes see, because financing comes later down the line, you can't build back into the design some of those KPIs that you might have wanted to do. So again, it's having those early conversations and bringing your financiers into that as well.
Thank you. Mark, was there anything you wanted to? You don't have to, but if you want to, I don't want to leave you out.
I will say something I didn't say earlier, that we were talking about, circularity, retention, reuse, recycling. All the best projects, actually, they're not mutually exclusive. The best projects involve all of those things. Where you'll be retaining as much as you can. You're reusing. We reuse steel a lot on projects. Holbein Gardens we did recently, we actually reused from the same site and then repurposed on that site. And then, you need to keep the materials at the highest possible quality, highest possible for reuse. So it's kind of an ever-evolving thing, sustainability, and it changes by the month, how you approach it.
Thank you. Next question, and again, I put this to the group. They say it's from Russell Cole. Thank you, Russell. A big barrier to reuse and retention is the new owner's desire or insistence of having a warranty for everything. Does the panel have any suggestions? Does the panel have any suggestions?
It's something that's come up recently on refurbishment projects, actually. Yeah. 2 or 3 schemes, fairly large schemes we're doing, where the contractor may have offered at tender stage to look at warrantying the existing structure. And when you dig deep and you look into it, it's a pretty impossible thing to actually offer. And it's kind of unnecessary. We're in an industry which is obsessed with warranties. And what does a warranty really mean? Is it 12 years life? If you keep a building dry, it will last pretty much forever. Look at the Victorian warehouses, they're 200 years old, they'll keep going. It's about having a kind of an informed team and an informed client, understanding risk, right? That's the biggest blocker to retention and reuse, the panic around refurbishment and reuse. And that's about having a fully informed team, a fully informed client, so they can make the right decisions before you go to tender and managing that process.
Yeah.
Go on. I was going to say, then that sort of talks, I haven't got a solution, sorry, first of all, but it does talk to my point about discomfort, and I think insurance is a real critical issue we have around things that can't be insured, and there's different ways, I haven't got the answer, and the different ways of looking at it, but that is one of those discomforts we're going to have to sort of work with.
Yeah, well, similar point, I was going to just pick up the point Mark's about risk, and I think you're absolutely right. I think risk can only be managed by someone if they're capable of managing it, and what I mean is they have to be able to understand what the risk is they're taking on board, otherwise it becomes a punt, doesn't it? It's a gamble otherwise. And I think some clients need to recognise that the risk does need to remain with them for certain elements of the building, and to be fair, there's lots of good clients that do that. Equally, they will recognise that it's unfair sometimes to push it onto an industry where they perhaps can't understand or manage that risk. Now, there's obviously things you can do, and it depends what you're actually taking the risk on board and what you're warranting. But yeah, I think it's constantly evolving, but it is a challenge to the industry.
Thank you. And we've got time just about for one more question, and this one, again, is anonymous, is directed at you, James. Okay. You're very popular today. Do you have targets to improve your rental housing stock to achieve EPC Band C or above by 2028, or is that just too hard with less economic return?
Is that specific to residential?
Yeah.
Or is that office?
Yeah, residential, it says here, rental housing.
Okay, I'll be frank and say that from a residential perspective, I am very, very limited within our portfolio and doesn't apply. What I will say is on a wider strategy, both alongside EPC, EPC-B challenges from a commercial perspective and the challenges that we've got, which obviously will extend into residential for the units that we do have, we have sort of superseded that with our own net zero ambitions. So whilst I might not be categoric on the answer, we are looking at the entire stock that we've got, particularly through our London estate, and challenging ourselves to put that in a condition by 2030 that we have delivered significant improvements that would make as much of that stock as possible EPC A, and obviously it will need to be EPC B to be let at that point. So hopefully that's...
Thank you very much. And that was with 1 second to spare. And I'm very proud as a moderator to have been within time. I wanted to thank all of our panellists for your generosity and your time, and for answering all of the questions as long as they may be, as thoroughly as you did. And also just to encourage you all to continue to have these conversations outside as you kind of make your way through the rest of the event. And so thank you all.